let's talk about in the Middle East, for example, where Sharon says, we are experiencing terrorist bombings, and therefore we have to have a big operation in the West Bank and root out terrorism. And people say, hey, you're violating human rights. And the Israelis say, there's no equivalency between suicide bombings and protecting our security. And the Palestinians say there's no equivalence between suicide bombings and the occupation.
This is the 35th year of a harsh, brutal, and vicious occupation, supported unilaterally by the United States, constant terror and atrocities. Suppose Palestinians say, well, we're under terrorist attack for 35 years, therefore we have a right to carry out suicide bombings.
Which is what they say.
Do you accept this? Does anybody accept it?
Nobody accepts it.
All right, then how come everyone accepts the Israeli claim to be doing it, which is a much weaker claim? Because after all, there's no symmetry in this situation. They are the military occupiers. Palestine isn't occupying Israel. And this isn't just started now. It's gone on years ago. I mean,
so does that, in your mind, justify
no,
the
it does not.
bomb?
Of course not. It
Doesn't.
doesn't in anybody's
So
mind.
it invalidates both sides.
Those who defend suicide bombing, and there are very few, don't have a leg to stand on. Those who defend the Israeli atrocities, including the U.S. government, most intellectual opinion, a good bit of the West generally, yeah, they don't have a leg to stand on either, and they have a much weaker position. So just take the Powell mission. Powell is praised because he's such a wonderful diplomat. He succeeded in, he went to Yasser Arafat and he extracted from him a statement condemning terror. Did anybody suggest that Powell should have asked Sharon to condemn the Israeli atrocities? Did anyone suggest that Powell ask George Bush to condemn the fact that he's been sending Israel the Apache attack helicopters, which have been devastating Jenin?
But the UN's been condemning them anyway.
Oh, no. You didn't understand my point. Did anybody suggest, can you find a word in the press anywhere, or anywhere, that suggested Powell should have requested a condemnation of Israeli terror from Sharon and of U.S. backing of that terror from Bush? I mean, that's a thought that couldn't enter anyone's mind. And the reason is because our profound commitment to terror and violence, when it's committed by our clients and by ourselves, that is so deep that we can't even think of the question.
You asked us after September 11, one of your points is we ought to look in the mirror, we being America or the West. We ought to look in the mirror at our own. Was that a way of saying, look, people like bin Laden are angry at us for good reason?
No,
in other words, is there a way to justify...
That's not what I was saying. The statement of mine that you just quoted is a very conservative statement. In fact, it was articulated by George Bush's favorite philosopher, Jesus Christ, who pointed out, famously, defined the notion hypocrite. A hypocrite is a person who focuses on the other fellow's crimes and refuses to look at his own. That's the definition of hypocrite by George Bush's favorite philosopher. When I repeat that, I'm not taking a radical position. I'm taking a position which is just elementary morality. We should pay attention to our own crimes and stop committing them.
Let's bring it to the bigger picture then, just because the question, he says, we all agree with the Gospels. This is, and then
He doesn't.
But he says, look,
does.
I believe in a Hobbesian world. This is what he says.
So is he saying we should overthrow
It's nasty. If you leave people alone, they'll kill each other.
Yeah.
And that's why what you need, what he calls, is an organizing hegemon, an overweening power.
Which is always us.
Yeah, which is always us, he says.
Right, because and why is it us? Because we have the power. And we have a massively subservient intellectual class, of which he's an illustration, which will support U.S. atrocities no matter how awful they are.
But he says this is real politics, that Chomsky's off in another land with his gospel, that he says, look...
Forget gospel. I'm talking about the most elementary morality. If a person doesn't understand that, they have no right to talk. Okay? If you don't understand that you pay attention to your own crimes, you have no right to talk. Let's take a look at the Middle East, but let's take a look at the facts. The facts are, for 35 years, there has been a harsh, brutal, miserable military occupation. There has not been a political settlement. The reason why there has not been a political settlement is that the United States unilaterally has blocked it for 25 years? Is it supported by the entire world, including the majority of the American people? The answer to that question is yes. There is a political settlement that has been supported by virtually the entire world, including the Arab states, the PLO, Europe, Eastern Europe, Canada.
Didn't Barack put that on the table?
No, he did not.
He did not.
What Barack put on the table, the population doesn't know this because people like the Western media, the media in Canada and the United States don't tell them. Like, you can check and see how often you, for example, or others have reported what I just said. Don't bother checking. The answer is 0. The Barack proposal in Camp David, in the Barack Clinton proposal, in the United States, I didn't check the Canadian media. In the United States, you cannot find a map, which is the most important thing, of course. Check in Canada and see if you can find a map. You go to Israel, you can find a map. If you go to scholarly sources, you can find a map. Here's what you find when you look at a map. You find that this generous, magnanimous proposal provided Israel with a salient east of Jerusalem, including the city of Ma'ale Adumim, which was established primarily by the Labor government in Clinton in order to bisect the West Bank. That salient goes almost to Jericho, breaks the West Bank into 2 cantons. Then there's a second salient to the north, going to the Israeli settlement of Ariel, which bisects the northern part into 2 cantons. So we've got 3 cantons in the West Bank, virtually separated. All 3 of them are separated from a small area of East Jerusalem, which is the center of Palestinian commercial and cultural life and of communication. So you got 4 cantons, all separated from the west, from Gaza, so that's 5 cantons, all surrounded by Israeli settlements, infrastructure development, and so on, which also incidentally guarantee Israel control over the water resources, the region. Last comment. This does not rise to the level of South Africa 40 years ago, when South Africa established the Bantustans. That's the generous, magnanimous offer.
Okay.
And there's a good reason why maps weren't shown, because as soon as you look at the map, you see it.
All right. Tell me, what state does function according to what you call the minimal levels of honesty? Is there a state?
None. States are power centers. The only thing that imposes constraints on them is either outside force or their own populations. The United States, for example, is far more civilized than it was 40 years ago. Let's just take that. This March happened to be the 40th anniversary of the public announcement by the Kennedy administration that the U.S. Air Force is bombing South Vietnam. It also initiated chemical warfare to destroy crops, initiated napalm, started driving millions of people into concentration camps. Did we commemorate the 40th anniversary? No. Why? Because 40 years ago, nobody cared. If the government announces, okay, we're going to start bombing another country and use chemical warfare to wipe out their crops and drive them to concentration camps, fine, not a problem. So there was no protest and no discussion.
But now there's more protest and discussion.
Yes, because the country has gotten more civilized. No U.S. president today, or for the last 20 years, could conceivably do what Kennedy could do with total impunity 40 years ago. And the reason is because there was massive popular protest. It led to all sorts of things, including opposition to aggression and violence. It also spawned the contemporary civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the environmental movements, and all sorts of other things. And it imposed important constraints on straight violence. In fact, that's how we got rid of slavery. That's how we got rid of feudalism. That's how every step of...
So are we moving towards an emancipation from these things?
Slowly.
You're optimistic?
Yes. Over time, there has been agonizingly slow progress, but very real, always opposed by the intellectuals who support violence and atrocities and try to justify them and try to prevent the population from knowing about them. The immediate problem is to free ourselves from the shackles imposed very consciously by the kind of people you're talking about, who don't want the facts to be known, and for very good reasons, because if people know the facts, they're not going to tolerate them. So therefore you have to prevent them from knowing. You have to indoctrinate them. You have to tell them stories about how we're really good guys, and if we use violence, it must be for the general good because we represent the course of history. Yeah, that's the job of propagandists for power and violence. And it's the task of populations to free themselves from those kinds of controls and domination.